From WisPolitics in Madison, you're listening to Capital Chats.
Hello, everybody. This is Kate Morton with WisPolitics here with a Capital Chats podcast brought to you by Spectrum. Today, I am here in the office with my colleague Abigail Lovins following last night's big election night in Wisconsin to talk about a conversation she had on the results with Marquette Law School poll director Charles Franklin. So, Abigail, what did you guys talk about?
Yeah, we had a great discussion about the results from last night. We specifically talked a lot about the Supreme Court race and Elon Musk's involvement, as well as a few other statewide races.
Great. Well, let's hear some of Charles' analysis.
Thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast with me. Obviously, we had a pretty big election in Wisconsin last night, so wanted to debrief that with you as something I know you guys have been doing polling on this throughout earlier this year and wanted to ask you a little bit about that and what happened.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to start by asking you about voter turnout. Obviously, there was record voter turnout last year, breaking previous records. Tell me, what factors do you think contributed to this?
I think both sides really succeeded in their goal of mobilizing voters that hadn't turned out in spring elections before. We're up over 500,000 additional votes compared to 2023. And both sides raised their totals quite a bit, about 280,000 additional votes for Crawford and about 245,000 additional votes for Schimmel compared to the 2023 Supreme Court race. Overall, we're at 2.3, almost 2.4 million total votes. That shatters the previous spring election totals and puts us at about 63% of registered voters turning out compared to about 50% of registered voters that voted in 2023. So I think if you judge the success of the campaign as the success in turning out both sides' core supporters, both sides did that very well. The Democrats a little bit more successfully than the Republicans, getting 280,000 extra votes compared to 245,000. So that's a little bit of an edge to Democrats on the turnout side of things. But both of them are enormous numbers that we would have just laughed at the possibility of in spring elections 5 years ago.
Well, there were a few statewide races on the ballot that I want to ask you specifically about. And the first one is the Wisconsin Supreme Court race, which turned into something that the nation watched. And last night, Susan Crawford won by quite a bit. And Elon Musk was pretty involved in this race, donating tons of money. And y'all's national poll that came out today indicated a lot of dissatisfaction with not only President Trump, but even more with Elon Musk. Wondering if you think his involvement ended up hurting Brad Schimmel or what dissatisfaction with him and the president, how did that play a role in this race?
Yeah, Elon Musk and his associated groups spent about $25 million, I think, in this race. And I'd have to say 25 million doesn't buy as much as it used to. In terms of the percentage margin in the race, Crawford won this by 10, whereas 2 years ago, Protasewicz won by 11. So the percentage margin just decreased by a single percentage point, a really minimal impact. And if you look at the votes around the state, it doesn't look like it reshaped voting patterns in the state very much at all. But again, to give credit where credit's due, the very high turnout really is, I think, an effect of the intense campaign. But what we see is if you run an intense campaign, two sides get to play that game. And Democrats played it slightly more effectively than Republicans did, though both of them have a lot to be pleased with on the turnout side. But in the end, the winner is the winner, and by a margin that is right in line with recent Supreme Court races that the liberal candidate has won by 12, and then 10, and then 11, and now by 10 again. There's not much of a shift across those races. Only the Hagedorn race in 2019 was decided by less than a percentage point. So in that sense, all of this money and Musk's involvement did not reshape the Supreme Court electoral landscape to any appreciable degree. Um, I think his involvement also provided Democrats with a campaign issue because certainly in the last 3 weeks, you saw very heavy negative advertising using Musk as the foil. Had he not been involved in the race, Democrats would have had to find some other issue to use for that motivating factor. Maybe they would have found it, but we'll never know. Arguably, Musk did raise Republican turnout, but at the price of Democrats being given a campaign issue that they really used heavily. If we look at the polling, Musk's favorability numbers are anywhere from 5 to 7 points lower than Trump's are. In our March Wisconsin poll, he had about a 41% favorable rating. In our new national poll that came out Wednesday morning, he has a 38% national favorability. And so those numbers are not as compelling as Donald Trump's. And that raises questions about how effective Musk can be as a surrogate for Trump in campaigns, because he's simply not as popular a figure as Trump is, and he's not as popular with Republicans as Trump is. Um, and so I think that really does raise the question of whether he's an effective surrogate. I would be very surprised to see him involved in the November elections for governor in Virginia and New Jersey, given the outcome here. But I guess we'll find out next fall.
You mentioned twice that you feel Democrats did really well in mobilizing voters and slightly better than Republicans. What do you think was the elements that they played really well? Was it playing up that Musk involvement and using that to their advantage, or were there other things that were pretty similar to what they did in 2023?
Well, I'm sure that in terms of the ground game, contacting voters and that sort of thing, the Democrats have a well-honed ground game. I'm sure that they've employed that to maximal effect this time. It's not as visible as Musk's efforts were, so we don't have quite the same knowledge of how that played out. Um, but you'd also have to credit the Democratic electorate, which in spring elections for 5 election cycles now has been really remarkably more activated than the Republican electorate has been. So that the relative Democratic advantage was barely changed this time, despite all of the mobilizing on the Republican side. That suggests a pretty resilient Democratic base for spring elections. But as we saw in November, that doesn't carry over into November elections.
Another race I wanted to ask you about is the state superintendent race. And that one also had record spending numbers, record attention on it, but it still seemed to be mostly drowned out by the Supreme Court race. Do you feel like in your polling you noticed it?
Yeah.
In the earlier poll that came out, it seemed that a lot of people didn't even know who Jill Underly or Brittany Kinzer were. Is that a theme you noticed?
No, that I think the DPI race just was overwhelmed by the Supreme Court race in terms of advertising, but also in terms of media attention. If you looked around, you could find coverage, good articles covering the superintendent's race, but they were just so much fewer than the coverage that was given to the Supreme Court race. And I think that's pretty natural. But the other side is the extent to which the simple coattails from the Supreme Court to the superintendent's race carried over. Um, we see that Underly did a little bit worse than Crawford did, uh, not dramatically so. Also, if you go back to that March poll that we did, Kinzer was actually seen as more favorably than unfavorably, while Underly was just a little bit more unfavorable than favorable. But neither of them were well known. It was over 60% that didn't know Underly and over 70% that didn't know Kinzer. Um, I don't know what would have happened. We'll never know if the Supreme Court race had been a snoozer and the superintendent's race had been the premier race. We'll never know what would have happened if education issues had been front and center in the campaign in March, as opposed to what really happened, where it was the Supreme Court that was front and center.
With that statement, do you think that a lot of people were saying ahead of the race that a Crawford win might lead to an Underly win, and same for Schimmel with Kinzer? Do you think that is part of it, that because more Democrats turned out, that's what ended up leading Underly to win, or maybe because she was the incumbent?
Yeah, these are supposedly nonpartisan races, but we've seen a strongly partisan structure to both the court and the DPI races for a number of years, 15 or more years. So I don't think anything fundamentally changed there. I think there was speculation ahead of time and without very much data, I should say, that Underly was a weaker candidate and might not fare as well. So I did hear a few people predicting a split outcome, but we didn't see that and we didn't really come very close to it in the end.
Sure. Another item on the ballot I wanted to ask you about was the photo ID amendment, and that one passed pretty easily. And your polling earlier this year indicated that 77% of potential voters supported this. Is this the what you expected? What did you notice about party split with in your polling? Were most people from different parties in support?
Right. Yeah, as you say, in March, we had 77% in favor of photo ID as a law. I think it was 74% favored the amendment. Um, and so that's pretty close to where it turned out in the end. This is one where support for photo ID was controversial. It was about evenly split when we first got photo ID in 2011, 2012 rather. Um, but um, since then, we've seen support for it simply build into the 70s, and it's been in the 70s for several years now. I think there's just some people have said, how is it that photo ID passes by so much and that the liberal candidate wins the Supreme Court? But I just think these are unconnected things. Republicans have argued for a long time that photo ID is just common sense. And I think the polling evidence is that most people think it's just common sense. And, you could have a reasonable argument about whether an constitutional amendment was really needed or not. But voters didn't distinguish very much between the law and the amendment in our poll. Also, while Republicans and independents are hugely in favor of photo ID, even half of Democrats were in favor of it. So it's really not nearly as big a partisan split on photo ID as the polarization we see on many other issues.
Sure. Speaking of polling, I have one last question for you on looking at the overall election reflecting the day after. How well do you feel your polls and other polls you noticed did in this election? And what are some factors that might have separated the poll results from the actual results?
Yeah, well, we didn't poll on the court race, on the horse race. We polled a lot on the issues related to the court and to the DPI race back in March. That was part of the purpose, was to try to get some policy questions out there in the public. I don't think those messages were particularly followed, but overwhelmed by the Musk involvement. But we were looking at those things rather than the horse race. The polling that did come out was almost all from conservative aligned organizations. And it was notable that that polling almost all showed Crawford with a mid-single digits advantage, though there was one by Wisconsin Manufacturers and Commerce that showed a 47-47 tie. I think those polls did produce the impression that we might have a considerably closer race than we had in 2023. All of the polls except that one tie, I think, had the right winner. And so, in that sense, they pointed in the right direction. But the magnitude of the win of 10 points, I don't think I saw any recent polling that showed as much as a 10-point victory. So, a little bit of an underestimation of the size, but near unanimity on who the winner was likely to be.
Sure. And I guess I do have one more question for you because you mentioned you didn't really pull on the horse race, you pulled on more of the issues. And you kind of hinted that Elon Musk ended up becoming a bigger issue than some of those. But looking at that polling, now that Crawford has won, are there any issues that you think are going to be a focus based on what people are interested in?
Yeah, I think the agenda of the court is still a little unclear once Crawford takes the seat in August. We have a few cases that are pending now, but will be decided by the current court, not the future one. I think there was a lot of speculation about possible congressional redistricting, about the Act 10 case, which almost certainly will come before the court in the coming months. Um, there's also not so much talked about issues of the relative strength of the governor and the legislature and how much the legislature can use committees to approve legislation after the budget has been passed. Those are pretty important questions for the balance of power in the Capitol. But they were never central issues of the campaign. Other things like where the public stands on abortion was a bit of the Supreme Court campaign, but we've seen very little movement in the public's opinion on abortion since Roe versus Wade was overturned in 2022. We consistently see a little over 60% in favor of abortion being legal in all or most cases, and in the mid 30s opposed to that. So there's really not been very much movement on that at all.
Yeah. Well, Charles, that's all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk through the election results with me.
Thanks for having me.
All right, everyone, thanks for tuning in to this week's podcast episode. In the meantime, if our listeners want to hear more about last night's election, they can head to our website at wispolitics.com and check out our election blog. In the meantime, I am Kate Morton.
And I'm Abigail Evans.
Thanks for tuning in to WIS Politics Capital Chats, brought to you by Spectrum.